ArchivesSpace. And with that, we're actually going to get started. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Bree, if you want to go ahead and start sharing yours while I read your introduction. First up, we have Bree McLaughlin of Indiana University presenting Training and Managing Multiple ArchivesSpace Repositories at a Very Large Institution. Indiana University's ArchivesSpace instance hosts 31 repositories across 7 campuses. Each campus has its own needs, and each repository's needs are even more specific. Contemplating how to introduce a new application to dozens of collections managers while training oneself is overwhelming. In this session, Bree will present a use case of how to address the specialized needs of multiple institutions while providing broad instruction. This presentation will be useful for any ArchivesSpace member institution getting started creating local workflows, but especially for very large institutions. In addition to practical training and recommendation, Bree will also express the importance and benefits of cultivating and maintaining relationships with collections managers and share experience with managing the impossibly large amount of metadata shared by all repositories. With that, I'll turn things over to Bree.
Okay, and are we seeing my presentation right now?
We're seeing your presentations and we can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. All right, my name is Bree McLaughlin. I'm the Digital Collections Librarian at Indiana University. Today, I'm going to be sharing what I've learned from training and managing multiple ArchivesSpace repositories at a very large institution. I've utilized passive and active training methods, and my goal has been to create enough training materials that collection managers can feel self-sufficient. I'm available to help, but that's not always sustainable for so many repositories. This model has gone pretty well for us, so hopefully it will be helpful to you, especially if you're just getting started in ArchivesSpace. Obviously, the ArchivesSpace Help Center is an invaluable resource for myself and all users at IU. The training materials that I'll describe today are supplemental and provide specific recommendations based on our use cases. I will be talking about a lot of documents and training materials throughout this presentation, and I've linked them all at the end. They're all publicly available, and I am happy to share. Indiana University is made up of 7 campuses across Indiana. Our ArchivesSpace instance is home to 31 repositories across those campuses. I started this job in February 2020, and my main priority was to prepare for and manage the migration of all of our finding aids from a legacy system into ArchivesSpace by summer 2020. I won't speak to the actual migration part in this presentation because a lot of it was planned before my time at IU, and at that point, our very talented graduate student employees were the ones making that migration possible. I'm going to progress through this presentation more or less chronologically to show when and how I started managing and training multiple repositories in ArchivesSpace. Weeks after I started this job, I suddenly found myself working from home with a lot of time to myself. I used this time to hunker down and begin learning ArchivesSpace with the goal of having basic documentation to share before finding aids migrated in the summer. And you'll see on this timeline that I was able to share the basic documentation in March 2020 that I adapted from existing documentation from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, IUPUI. This seems crazy to me 4 years later, and my best guess is that I was on the hyperfixation peak of the lockdown roller coaster. I do not recommend this pace in this timeline in general. But with that said, I was also learning ArchivesSpace at the same time, and writing documentation was like writing notes to me. This is what most of our basic ArchivesSpace documentation looked like. We went pretty much field by field, defining and making recommendations for each. The helpful hints that pop up when you mouse over fields in ArchivesSpace are helpful, but some of our collection managers requested having similar information in a document that they could print out and refer to when they aren't actively using ArchivesSpace. And by summer 2020, collection managers had the tools necessary to create basic collection level finding aids. I also adapted the glossary from the ArchivesSpace Help Center to specifically address questions that had arisen from conversations with collection managers just getting started. For example, The concept of a top container versus an instance was hard for us to wrap our heads around. I created the image on the right in the documentation to hopefully clear that up. I still update this glossary in direct response to the questions that warranted the term being added to the glossary. I also started bi-weekly office hours in spring 2020 to get folks acquainted with ArchivesSpace before all of their finding aids migrated. I still hold those office hours today. They're usually actually happening right now, but I only do them once a week now. Attendance definitely ebbs and flows, but collection managers like knowing that there is a set time that they can come to ask me questions or send their student employees for an introduction to ArchivesSpace. I listened to the concerns being raised during my office hours and other meetings and created training materials accordingly. Once collection managers felt more or less comfortable using ArchivesSpace to view existing finding aids and create basic collection level finding aids, the next priority was to provide instructions for adding inventories to new finding aids. The next training materials I created/adapted were for the spreadsheet importer back when it was just a plugin. I can't remember when that became part of the core code, but we were using version 2.7.1 until last year, so that definitely didn't apply to us yet. One of our graduate student employees began adapting Harvard's documentation, and she expanded on the common issues section at the end of that documentation, which I think is the most read part of this documentation. She provided screenshots of error messages to fix she provided screenshots of error messages and how to fix data to avoid those errors. Fortunately for her and unfortunately for me, she graduated, so I finished the document along with the help of volunteer collection managers. I added sections like you can see on the left to illustrate concepts like ingest hierarchy that are hard to explain without a visual. Along with the documentation, I adapted our spreadsheet template to fit our needs. We had and still have a massive metadata problem, especially right after migrating. And I try to nip that in the bud at any opportunity I have. One major help was adding additional validation to fields in the spreadsheet template. The main culprit for our metadata problem was extent type. After migration, I think we had well over 2,000 extent types. We have since cut and merged over 1,000 of those. And that is a story I'd be happy to complain about another time. During monthly meetings with collection managers, we came up with a controlled list of extent types to add to a validator on the template. It's a long list, but still only a fraction of what we were dealing with. And remember that we have 31 repositories whose collections span many mediums that require different extent types. This list isn't set in stone, and folks still add me to add values every now and then. It's not a perfect system, but it has massively reduced the duplicate, near duplicate, or inaccurate extent types. Folks were still getting intimidated by the spreadsheet importer, so I made some supplemental training videos. In one video, I go through the fields of the spreadsheet template, and in the other, I demonstrate sample imports. A few months later, volunteer collection managers and I created documentation for rapid data entry. This was the first piece of documentation that we created completely from scratch. Much of my recommendations were the same as the spreadsheet importer, but with different mechanics. I also included information about creating templates, including naming conventions, since the templates are shared between repositories, and that could get very messy very fast. If I could choose only a handful of overall recommendations for folks getting started in ArchivesSpace, it would almost always be naming conventions. By the time I was writing this documentation, it became clear from collection manager feedback that they wanted all the examples, especially from other repositories. One thing I hadn't considered is that since most of our repositories are at least in different buildings, let alone different cities, they don't know how others are using ArchivesSpace in the user interface. I thought it would be a good idea to get samples from a few collection managers at different repositories to add to an appendix, like you can see on this slide. Speaking of examples, I created 2 demo videos for rapid data entry as well. The first video had common examples or examples of common entries in rapid data entry. And the second is an overview of time-saving tips using features like fill column and sticky columns. And we can make these videos available through a service that we have on campus, Media Collections Online, which is publicly available. And as I mentioned before, we were using version 2.7.1 until last year. And for anybody who has used ArchivesSpace for a few years or more, you'll know that rapid data entry has been massively improved since then. With that said, I spent a lot of the time in these videos saying, okay, this is an example of a bug in rapid data entry, and this is how you work around it. And it's those details that are specific to our instance of ArchivesSpace and the version that we're using. Jump scare for a giant decision tree. There was about a 6-month gap before the next piece of documentation. I think the beginning of 2021 is around when our quote unquote temporary COVID projects came to an end and collection managers were coming back to campus to handle existing collections in person. I fielded a lot of questions about editing existing finding aids in ArchivesSpace. Without getting into it too much, there isn't an easy answer to how do I edit finding aids. This monstrosity on the screen is the decision tree that simplifies the answer, which is essentially it depends. Volunteer collection managers and I set out to create the managing component list documentation from scratch to elaborate on this decision tree. Just like the decision tree, this documentation is organized by how the component list was originally created. I learned that it was important that was an important question in regards to having a backup inventory. For example, say a collection manager imported a spreadsheet of an inventory. They want to keep that inventory as a spreadsheet as a non-encoded backup. If they decide to use rapid data entry to add components, there isn't necessarily a way to export those components to a spreadsheet as a new backup. For that reason, it would be easier for that collection manager to continue using the spreadsheet importer rather than switching up their data entry method. We have a few collection managers who are dedicated to EAD, and to that I say power to them. But we also had some long-term archivists who could more easily make the connection between EAD and ArchivesSpace than what we had in the basic documentation. With that in mind, I adapted the EAD import and export map from the ArchivesSpace technical documentation to make an EAD appendix. The main difference is that I added examples from IU finding aids and arranged the categories to match our documentation. And on the right is a handy dandy note type appendix that I created beforehand to map note types from EAD to ArchivesSpace to ArcLight, which is our public user interface integration. As I mentioned before, we had and still have a metadata problem post-migration. Last I checked, we had around 40,000 subjects and agents in ArchivesSpace. With so many repositories and collection managers, duplicates, near duplicates, and errors are inevitable. Volunteer collection managers and I created this decision tree to help folks decide if they really needed to add a new agent or subject. The answer is usually no, the record already exists. I could get into that more, but that is yet another story I'd be happy to complain about another time. By 2022, IU collection managers pretty much had ArchivesSpace down for creating and managing finding aids. I started to hear some folks complaining about an archaic accession software, Ask Sam, and thus created the accession creation working group. Myself and volunteer collection managers created documentation for the bare minimum accession record in ArchivesSpace. We approached this in the opposite way of all of our previous documentation because there was really no benefit to repositories using the same model for accession records since they're all internal. So this documentation had the instructions for a basic accession record and for using accession or ArchivesSpace modules like events or functions like spawning resources to optimize accession creation. Okay, that was a lot. That was a lot of information. And I want to emphasize again that My documentation creation was fast-tracked by a variety of external factors, the primary of which being a global pandemic. But I was also new to a job where I didn't have many other service or research responsibilities yet. That pace was not normal, nor should a new ArchivesSpace service manager look to this timeline as aspirational. But what I want to make clear and what I'd like for folks to be able to take away from these examples is how the order of creation related to the feedback I was getting from collection managers and how I work to make each document broadly applicable to all 31 repositories. Now that I'm a couple years removed from creating all of those resources, this is my general workflow when somebody new is learning ArchivesSpace. First, I have a general introduction meeting with them if they're a new collection manager or have a specific collection in mind. We talk a little bit about their goals and what type of finding aid they're hoping to create. If it's a student or staff working under a collection manager, I try to share what I know about how their repository typically creates finding aids. Then I give them access to ArchivesSpace and give them links to all of the resources that I've talked about so far. I give them access to their home repository, but I also give them access to an unpublished training repository. This way they can practice without worrying about messing up on a finding aid that is publicly available. I strongly encourage them to use the training repository. In that first meeting, I share my screen and walk through the modules they'll be using in ArchivesSpace. The first meeting is inevitably overwhelming because it's an information dump from all of the resources that I'm sharing, but they usually leave feeling more confident about ArchivesSpace in general. And lastly, I expect periodic follow-up emails and office hour visits, and we just kind of feel it out from there. In a large institution with so many repositories, I think it's even more important to build trust with collection managers. Amidst all this documentation, I was chairing a committee called the Archives Online Working Group, named after Archives Online, which you can see on the right. That is our finding aid discovery website. This working group was made up of all collection managers across Indiana University campuses. I used this group to share updates about Archives Online, and we could also troubleshoot issues and plan customizations and improvements to our user interface. The working group is a great way to share updates and field questions. Collection managers had at least a monthly opportunity to be face-to-face with me, amongst other collection managers with similar questions. The communication throughout these meetings was crucial for such a large institution. Most do not use ArchivesSpace the same way, so finding common denominators was very helpful for me. Communication and relationship building with collection managers was imperative to making this work. Indiana University is a huge school. I work at the flagship location in Bloomington, and I quickly started picking up on some tension about non-Bloomington IU campuses feeling secondary in many ways because of the existing structure of communication. Having to work virtually due to COVID was actually an unforeseen equalizer in that respect. And I'm sure you've all attended a hybrid meeting where it kind of feels like you're a fly on the wall watching the meeting happen. Before COVID, the Archives Online Working Group meetings were hybrid, and since most collection managers are in Bloomington, the in-person part was in Bloomington and the regional campuses attended via Zoom. This problem definitely isn't exclusive to IU, and I get the feeling that this is how it worked with most large universities with regional campuses. Still, broad participation increased steadily once we were all on Zoom, which meant I was able to more effectively write documentation that would be useful for everybody. And I will continue to advocate for Zoom-only meetings for this working group for that reason. So that was my path to training and managing many repositories at a very large institution. I am still training folks periodically, whether they're student employees or new collection managers. I am also still keeping up with updating documentation as our circumstances change. For example, We upgraded to version 3.3.1 last year, finally, and each document that I've created needs a significant overhaul. The basic documentation is up to date, but I'm still working on the rest. And these are links to all of the documents that I've mentioned so far, or all the documents that I've created. The first link, the ArchivesSpace documentation and demo videos, is a umbrella wiki page that has links to everything as well. Right. I'm happy to take questions at the end of this session or via email. My contact information and links to all of the materials I mentioned are included here. And thank you very much for letting me be the first presenter today.
Thank you. Thank you for being the first presenter. That's always nerve-wracking. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for including those links in your presentation. Presentation slides will be made available with the recording. So I know many of you are already asking questions in the chat about that. So we're going to go ahead and move to the Q&A portion. We are going to do Q&A for 5 minutes. So let's do this. Let's do this, Bree. All right. So the first question we have is about your videos. How often do you have to update videos? How often do you need to add new ones? Do you already have a problem of needing to put a significant time into video creation and editing? How do you decide if it's too much work?
How do I decide if it's too much work? That's funny.
Yeah.
Clearly, I have an issue with that. But I haven't edited any of the videos yet, and that is one of those resources are what I am very anxious to update since we have upgraded our version of ArchivesSpace. My intention is to update our resources as we upgrade versions of ArchivesSpace. If there isn't a significant change in how we use ArchivesSpace based on a version upgrade, then it may not be necessary, but I'm trying to keep up to date with our upgrades.
Thanks. Rebecca says she likes the idea of office hours where archivists can ask questions. Can you say more about how those work and are they online?
Yeah, they're all virtual. And I started doing them bi-weekly, and now I just do them once a week. And I have a 2-hour time where I am on Zoom, a specific Zoom room that everyone has the link to. And I am just there in case anybody needs help. If they have questions, they don't have to tell me ahead of time if they're dropping by. And it's pretty flexible. Like I'll go months without anybody stopping by, and then suddenly it's week to week to week. Somebody is always there, but I keep notes for all of the office hours that are publicly available, so folks can, kind of see what other people are having questions about as well, and hopefully that kind of clears things up for multiple people.
That's interesting. You get to see when priorities are shifting according to who comes to the meetings. It's kind of fun. So Trip, I'm going to skip your second question, but we'll come back to it. Kevin asks, how did you decide when to write local documentation and when to rely on the ArchivesSpace documentation?
So I think it was when the number of questions that I had that were specific to our ArchivesSpace instance started to outweigh the questions that I could send them to the ArchivesSpace documentation for. And I also started to become, frankly, I started to become overwhelmed with all of the questions. So it's like, okay, I just need to make documentation that answers these questions, even if I'm repeating some information that's already available elsewhere.
Good point. It's an interesting turning point. And Kelly says, how do you approach management of container profiles across all of the repositories?
We don't use container profiles, and I've tried to gauge interest in container profiles several times, and our collection managers haven't seemed very interested in them. And I think it may also just be having a very large institution with a few repositories that are very large and have their own kind of space management systems in check already. So that's not really something that we have made use of.
Thanks. All right, last question. And so Trip asked, could you talk more about documentation maintenance and upgrades? Trip has just gone through one. I can tell. Talk about your maintenance schedule. And then there was another question that came to me directly about how the format that you provide this documentation. Is it PDF or Word documents? How do you maintain the documentation?
Yeah, so to address the first question, I kind of talked about, updating documentation along with our upgrades. And we do that with, the working group is called the Finding Aid Creation in ArchivesSpace Working Group. And we basically just comb through each document when we upgrade or have any changes in our use of ArchivesSpace. And we kind of just go section by section until we can check it off and share it again widely. And the second question, I forget what that is. What was the second question again?
So another question came to me about how the format that you make the documentation available in.
Right. We share them in PDFs, and as we've been updating our documentation, I've been doing my best to make them more accessible as well, adding alt text for all of the images as well. I've considered making them just on wikis or something like that, and I don't know if there's really any rhyme or reason why I chose PDF to begin with. But that's just kind of what we've stuck to at this point, other than some of the resources that are on the wiki, like the glossary or any of the appendices.
Awesome, thanks. That is a huge amount of work to maintain that documentation, Bree. So maybe a follow-up presentation next year where you talk about the ongoing maintenance of this. I know people would be interested. But thank you so much for sharing, and what a great way to kick off the forum. We are going to go ahead and move to our next presentation of the day. But if anyone has any